Haji Khairullah is one of the biggest hawala dealers in southern Afghanistan. That's a system where someone can walk into a shop and transfer pretty much any amount of cash to anywhere else in the network. He's got branches as far afield as Iran and Dubai, and of course Pakistan, where he's lived for years. If you speak to dealers in the currency market in Kandahar in southern Afghanistan, they'll tell you that Khairullah is one of the most revered members of their fraternity. But of course US officials take a rather different view. They suspect that he's one of the biggest bankers to the Taliban, and that his network is a key conduit for moving drug money. Khairullah told me that he's just an honest trader, but in June, the US Treasury and the United Nations slapped sanctions on Khairullah and his businesses. Since then, Washington's been doing all it can to try to shut him down. For a long time, the art of understanding insurgent finance was very much a neglected discipline. It's only really in the last few years, when the Obama administration ordered a much bigger shake-up of the war effort, that intelligence officials and investigators have taken a really hard look at where all this money's coming from. What they're discovering is that in many cases, the insurgents are running mafia-style businesses, often with these perfectly legitimate concerns serving as front companies. So in some respects, one could argue that the insurgency is taking on an almost self-sustaining momentum, where there's huge vested interests in insecurity, and a lot of people at the top of the chain are making a lot of money. Understanding that ecosystem, that murky landscape of transactions, is one of the main tasks now that investigators face if they really want to make an impact. The ironic thing is that American taxpayers have themselves helped to fund the Taliban, albeit indirectly. Here's how it works. The US military doesn't truck all its supplies across Afghanistan. It relies on a network of Afghan haulage companies to move food, fuel and equipment across these vast distances in often very dangerous terrain. What was happening was that these hauliers, or certainly their subcontractors, were paying protection money to insurgents along the route to let them pass by safely. So you had this bizarre situation where the US military was essentially funding its own enemies through this elaborate system of extortion. One of the most striking things about this subject is that the lines between the insurgency and officialdom are often so blurry. Hawala dealers will work with anyone. Some of them may be doing business with the Taliban or big drug traffickers one day, then helping power brokers or politicians align with the government the next. The Afghanistan Chamber of Commerce and Industries, which is a prominent private sector lobby group, is very concerned about the US suspicion of hawala dealers. In fact, it's called the sanctions on Haji Khairullah baseless propaganda. There's definitely an upwelling of resentment in the business community against the idea that authorities on the other side of the world can suddenly wake up one morning and decide to brand somebody as a Taliban sympathizer, which of course then produces a cloud of suspicion that makes it very hard for them to do business. People feel it's arbitrary. They want the US to publish its evidence against hawala dealers like Khairullah. The US Treasury, of course, will argue that it follows a very rigorous process, but as long as the evidence remains classified, many Afghans simply aren't going to believe them. What was so interesting about visiting Kandahar and speaking to dealers in the exchange was the esteem in which Haji Khairullah was held. People talked about him as a pillar of the community, a philanthropist who was noted for sending generous relief to villages struck by floods or earthquakes. He certainly wasn't seen as some sort of shadowy Taliban money man. Currency dealers I spoke to were surprised that he'd been put on a US sanctions list. It's obviously very hard to implement these sanctions. What I discovered in the course of my inquiries into Khairullah was that he'd actually proved pretty adept at staying a step ahead of the authorities. In Afghanistan, financial officials were baffled to find his accounts only held the equivalent of about $20,000 when he was suspected of moving huge sums of money. There was a suspicion that he probably received some sort of tip-off that allowed him to move his funds out of his usual accounts. Similarly, I often heard stories of Khairullah popping up in Quetta in Pakistan one day and then in Kandahar in Afghanistan the next, which suggests that he was evading a UN travel ban without too much difficulty. What we're seeing now in terms of the sanctions on suspected Taliban financiers like Haji Khairullah is the culmination of several years of work by investigators who try to track these kinds of flows. Indeed, the US Treasury sanctioned several more hawala dealers in November who are suspected of channeling large amounts of money to the Taliban, and we're likely to see a lot more of these designations in the future. The question, of course, is whether they'll work.
Mali today is split in two. Its north is in the hand of a mix of Islamist groups. The government in Bamako nominally is in charge of the south, but since a march coup. There are deep divisions within the political class and between civilians and the soldiers who carried out the coup, but then obviously officially handed over power.